Today on CityCast Philly, what do the Grays Ferry, Fairmount, and Tioga neighborhoods have in common? Taney Street. But that name triggers a racist history. Back in February, I spoke to neighbors who have fought to rename the street for years, but so far, the name Taney remains. It's Thursday, May 25th. I'm Taney, and here's what Philly's talking about. Samaya Brown, you're a member of the Rename Taney Coalition. It's been nearly 3 years of community organizing around this name change. What's the holdup?
That's a really good question. We don't actually know what the holdup is, other than that City Council has yet to put a one-line item on the agenda so that it can be voted on. When we first started as the collective together, we worked in conjunction with Councilmember Johnson's office to come up with a way to do the community engagement process.
And what did that process look like?
Well, because it was the height of COVID, we really couldn't do what they normally ask, which is that you go door to door and have people sign petitions. So in conjunction and collaboration with Councilmember Johnson's office, we came up with ways to do it electronically. We had door knockers that had all of the required information on it. We had town halls that we did online. We had events that we could do in person, but with social distancing. We really came up with a comprehensive way to do what you're supposed to do, which is to tell people what you are trying to do, which is get the street name change, get them on board with it, and then also identify what the name change will be, because that's also a requirement.
So you're proposing that the street be named after a Philadelphia trailblazer, Caroline LeCount. Who was she?
Caroline LeCount has an amazing story. She is known as Philadelphia's Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks?
Yeah. Well, let me just give you a little bit of background about her, because I just think that her story is so amazing. And actually, we didn't come up with her as one of the options. This was just going door to door to community members. And several of them kept saying, okay, what about Caroline LeCount? Because her story is not that well known.
She integrated the streetcars, right?
Yes, that's correct. So what she would do is go ride the trolley cars. And if somebody would try to stop her, she would call the police. The police would come and they would say, no, you have to let them ride. And she would confront conductors who refused to stop for Black riders. And she really just stood up for the desegregation of the trolley car system in Philadelphia.
What time period was this?
This would have been back around 1867 or so. So she was born in South Philadelphia to Sarah and James LeCount. James was a carpenter and a figure in the Underground Railroad, and he used to hide fugitive slaves in coffins to carry them from one area to the other, which is a pretty cool fact. She attended Philadelphia's Institute for Colored Youth, which is the genesis of Cheney University, which is the oldest institution of higher learning for African Americans. Then she became a teacher at Ohio Street School. And their job was to educate the city's young Black population. And then she later became the principal of that. And she was engaged to Octavius Cotto, who himself is a pretty famous Philadelphian.
Yes, he's probably like one of my favorite Philadelphians.
Yeah. And they were engaged to be married, but unfortunately he was assassinated attempting to vote in 1871.
Okay, so let's back up all the way. That's who you want to rename the street after. But we have to go back into history. Let's talk about who the street is still named after. A man named Roger B. Taney. Tell us who he was.
So Roger B. Taney was a Supreme Court justice who did the infamous Dred Scott decision, in which he made a ruling that Blacks could not be citizens of the United States because they were not human.
Wow.
Yes, it is one of the things that pushed us into the Civil War. It was immediately controversial, and it has the infamous distinction of being the worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court in history.
Do we know if Taney had connections to the city?
We actually know that he had none of any significance, and just historically in general, that is his only claim to fame. He has no positive impact on U.S. history as far as we can tell.
So I read that the Dred Scott decision happened in 1857, right?
Correct.
And 1 year after that, that's when the city renamed Minor Street Taney Street.
Yes, that is correct. Mayor Vo, at the time, he was a white supremacist, and several of the men who were doing the ordinances, they all have white supremacist ties. And it is pretty clear. I mean, Taney is not an ambiguous figure. There's only one. That was the purpose, to name the street after him.
Samaya, you bought a house just a few years ago. Was it your first house?
Yeah, it was actually about 4 years ago, back in 2018. I'm an Army brat, lived all over the world, never more than 2 or 3 years in the same place. So when I graduated college, I decided to put roots down somewhere, came to Philadelphia, found a house in Brewery Town, which is a up-and-coming neighborhood in the city, bought it, took a 1-block walk around my neighborhood. I looked up and I was like, wow, that's crazy that the street is named this.
Why did that bother you?
Because again, he's not an ambiguous figure. There's only one Taney. He's only known for one thing. And I think that that's a pretty intentional thing to do to uphold the system of racism that is prevalent throughout this country. So to see it standing 150 years after it has just been clear that that was a terrible decision and just an abhorrent view of a fellow human being and a fellow American, that his name would still be up there was just shocking, but not surprising to me.
Okay, so how did you get involved with the coalition?
So as soon as I saw that name, I'm somebody who's heavily involved in community affairs and outreaches. I started doing some research to figure out how do I get this name taken down. And at the same time, there were several different people who were doing their version of that. And I happened to see something about renaming Taney where Leo Vaccaro, Ben Keyes, and Joshua Isserman and Tyree Glasgow were asking people to write letters to city council. And I wrote a letter. Leo saw it and he contacted me and he was like, oh my God, you are saying what we are trying to say better than we were saying it, a little bit more eloquently. Can we all join forces together? Because this is not the first time this name has tried to be changed. There have been several efforts to do that, even back in the 80s and 90s. And so the coalition as it is now, we are just dedicated to not stopping until it gets done.
So what's next in this process?
So right now, we have just done our 4th pass through the 5th District, Taney Street, which is Councilmember Clark's district. He has asked us to get a supermajority of people who live on Taney Street in the 5th District to agree to the name change and to prove that they understand what their responsibility will be if the name is changed. But the issue with that is that we don't have any way to know what a supermajority number is. So we are just collecting more and more signatures and then resubmitting them to his office in the hopes that he will put the one-line item on the agenda so that it could be voted on by the rest of the city council.
How do you even change a street name?
It's actually pretty simple. So in terms of what has to happen in order for it to be approved, city council has to vote on it. If they say yes, it's a done deal. They would have to change some street names, update some maps. That's not that intensive. There's really not a big impact other than it is a positive change towards a better Philadelphia for all of us.
What keeps you motivated with this activism?
It's something that has always been important to me and to my family. We grew up poor. My mom joined the military. So we really got to see a different understanding of how people live, not only in America, but throughout the world. And there really is nobody who's going to do anything for you, including our government, unfortunately. It really has to start and stay with the people. So I just know this is an important matter, along with all of the other things that we are fighting. There's only one way to stop systematic racism, and that is to address every instance that you see it and make sure that it's eradicated. There is no other way that we are going to reach equality.
Some people might say, that's just old history. There's buildings named after people. There's still statues named after people that have, varying histories. Why does a street name matter?
That's a really good question. And that's probably one of the things that people say the most when they are against it, even though that number is very small. They like to say, you can't change history. You can only learn from it. But according to the dictionary, learning is a process that leads to change. So just knowing a piece of information is not a lesson learned. You have to apply it. If I hand you a piece of paper with some numbers on it, you might know conceptually like, oh, this is math. But if you can't put pen to paper and apply the equations and solve the problems, then you did not learn math. So what we're fighting for today in 2023 in a myriad of ways is the same thing that we have always been fighting in this country, and that's inequality. We have not reached equality. There remains a staunch resistance to achieving it, even in the most low-stakes, mundane ways, like scraping a name off the side of a building or changing it on a street sign.
Samaya Brown, member of the Rename Taney Coalition. Thanks for joining me on CityCast Philly.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you want to get involved with the work that the coalition is doing, you can write a letter to your city council member. We'll have a link to the coalition's website in our show notes. And here's what else Philly's talking about. This weekend, Philly is opening over 90 spray grounds. These are play areas for kids that feature sprinklers or misters to cool off during those hot summer weeks. They're ran by the Parks and Rec Department. They'll be open on weekdays from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. and on weekends from noon to 5 p.m. You can find your nearest one at phila.gov. We'll have a link in our Hey Philly newsletter. And the Philadelphia Zoo wants your help with naming its newest sloth bear cubs. Now, according to the zoo, this is the first time in more than 30 years that a pair of these cubs were born here. Zoo staff have proposed names with Philly connections that you can vote on, including, and I love these ideas, Kelsey and Harper for the Eagles player Jason Kelsey and Philly slugger Bryce Harper. Or how about this one, Hall and Oates for the iconic Philly music duo. People can vote now through Sunday, May 28th, and the winning names will be announced on Monday, May 29th. To cast your vote, go to philadelphiazoo.org. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode, tell your neighbor, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter too. It's called Hey Philly. We'll be back tomorrow morning with the Friday News Roundup. Bye.